really, no, you can raise your hand and tell me what happened. Yes.
Peace agreement.
Very nice. Which peace agreement?
With Egypt.
Very good, very good.
Camp David, I think.
You're doing a good job in LSE, very nice. Very nice. So I was basically born to a very historic moment in Israel's life and the Middle East life. I was born to a moment where Israel's Prime Minister, Menachem Begin, outreached the Egyptian President, Anwar Sadat, and he offered him to sit and negotiate after Israel had gone through one of the worst wars. Israel was attacked in 1973. Egypt was probably our worst enemy. And they managed in a very short time to reach out a wonderful historic peace agreement. But till today, over 40 years after, we're still celebrating it. And we still have a very strong cooperation with Egypt. This is the first moment. First moment is I was born to a reality that peace with the Arab world is something that is possible. It's not just written in our independent declaration that we reach out to all our neighbors and we want to have peace. We actually can make it. And it was a very, very big event. Let's do fast forward. I was a high school youngster. During my high school years, we had another historic moment, peace agreement with Jordan. Another wonderful event. Both events, by the way, gave our leaders Nobel Prize for Peace. And everyone thought the Middle East is changing. And then came a very, very scary moment in my life. I was 16. My high school was in Tel Aviv. I'm sure all of you that visited Israel have been to Tel Aviv. It's in the middle of Israel. I went to a regular high school. And then in the middle of the day, bus that I was about to come on just exploded. Over 20 people get killed from a suicide bomber. And this event happened just after Israel was trying to reach to another landmark with the Arab world, with the Palestinian neighbors. Our leaders signed an agreement called the Oslo Accords in 1993. And deep into the 90s, Israel was attacked in horrible, horrible terror attacks after the Palestinians have been offered a state by the Israeli leadership. So this is the second moment I want to take you to in my political journey, let's call it. And then let's move fast forward. For 25 years, Israeli leadership is trying to reach peace agreement, another peace agreement with the Arab world, with our neighbors, with the Palestinians. And in 2005, Israeli Prime Minister decides to remove all Israeli settlements in our southern border. Maybe this is the issue. If the issue is not, they've been offered a state, they said no. So let's try to move Israeli settlements. Maybe this is the issue. In 2005, very dramatic political decision is being made by Israeli Prime Minister. Many people are opposing this decision because they're saying it will bring more terror to Israel. But he says, no, we need to move forward with peace. And he makes this decision. 7,000 people lose their homes, become refugees in their own homeland. And the result was a disaster. A few years after this moment, unfortunately, Israel is still having battles time after time with Gaza, because after a democratic election in Gaza, after people said Gaza will become a Middle East Singapore, Gaza will become a wonderful, wonderful economic enterprise, because the international community is putting so much money and efforts in the piece of land is called Gaza. In a democratic election, Hamas, a terror organization, is being elected. And Hamas keeps on shooting rockets from kindergarten to schools. I remember myself as a young mother taking my eldest daughter, Mayan, to a shelter in one of our military operations protective edge. It was very, very scary. I was sitting in a shelter with my baby in the middle of Israel, and I was saying, wait a second, they've been offered a state they don't want. We moved settlements, they're not interested. So what is really the story between the Israelis and the Palestinians? We managed to have peace with Egypt. We managed to have peace with Jordan. And in 2020, another historic moment came. Israel managed to have a peace agreement with the Gulf countries, the Abraham Accords, as you all know. The Abraham Accords was an incredible moment. We managed to have the leadership of the Arab countries not being part of our coalition that says we are dependent on the Palestinians. it was a change of a paradigm in the Middle East. Our neighbors in the Gulf said, Israel is a great friend. Israel is a solution to many of the problems in our region. We're not going to wait forever for the Palestinians to decide to have peace with Israel. Israel is interested in peace. Let's go and engage with Israel. And this is where the Abraham Accords were signed. So during my very short lifetime, I've experienced 3 dramatic peace agreements with Egypt, with Jordan, and with the Gulf countries called the Abraham Accords. And we have experienced an ongoing process of over 25 years that Israel tried almost every formula that was on the table. And eventually most Israelis have realized that we will have peace with our neighbors just in the moment they would like to have peace, just like we had with the Egyptians, with the Jordanians, and with our friends in the Gulf. And this is a very, very short episode through my life of how Israel was outreaching peace throughout, since I remember myself as a child. And I think for many people that are watching the media and sometimes try to understand the conflict, one of the things I think they miss out in the big picture is the fact that since Israel was established, since the Jewish people were back to their homeland, since the Balfour Declaration in 1917 that made a very clear announcement by what became later on the decision of the League of Nations that the Jewish people belong to the land of Israel. They need to be back to their homeland. Since then, Israel is trying to reach peace. And in order to reach peace, just like when you have a love affair, it's not enough that just one side is interested. Because if you're imposing something on the other side, maybe it's called rape, but it's not called peace. You cannot impose peace. You can only have peace when both sides are interested and when both sides are having direct dialogue. This is how we reach peace with all our neighbors. And I truly believe that in my generation time, if we will have the right leadership on the Palestinian side, I'm sure my kids can grow up in a world where no bloodshed and no rockets will be thrown in our region. This is my short presentation. Please go for it.
Maybe what we should do is just move the podium out of the way and then so that everyone can. That's good. Yeah. Well, thank you again for coming. As I understand, this is your first occasion at a university. And
no, just in LSE.
I mean, at the LSE. Well,
I've been to many universities.
No, but at
yeah.
Here.
As an ambassador.
As an ambassador. So I actually wanted to speak to you in your this isn't not a new role. You've been here about a year.
Yes.
In that role. How has being an ambassador changed? You're now representing the state of Israel.
Yes.
You're not in Netanyahu's government. Has that broadened, has that softened your positions that you've taken in the past? Have you had to, or maybe reflected on and softened them for other reasons? Have your views changed in making that switch from being a rank and, well, not a rank and file, a high-ranking politician in Netanyahu's government, the settlements minister, to being an ambassador representing the state of Israel?
First of all, it's, as I told you when we were having a conversation before I came in, there is something very good in being a diplomat as opposed to a politician. I'll tell you a joke. My husband said I was choosing all the low prestige professions in my life. So I started as a lawyer, as maybe some of you are trying this profession, quite low. And then I made the switch to journalism. Some people think it gets lower, but then I reached out all the way to the floor and became a politician. So first of all, I'm trying now to make my reputation go higher. So as a diplomat, I definitely feel like I'm working more on building bridges than in politics, where you need to fight every day for your views. So here I'm doing something that represents a wider spectrum of Israeli people. So this is the first thing. About views. In order to understand what a diplomat in my role is doing, we need to understand that the bilateral relations with Israel and the UK is based on 3 very important pillars. One is economy. UK is our third trade partner. And one of the things we want to do here is to sign a new trade agreement after Brexit. And I think that it doesn't matter where you're coming from, whether you're coming from left or right or center in Israel, you are interested to have a better trade deal to your country. And the UK is interested to have a better trade deal to this country because Israel is a very, very successful technological hub. And we can do many things in a modern trade agreement. So this has nothing to do basically to political views, I would say. This is pure economy and economic cooperation. The second issue is collaboration in security, which is something we do very well. And again, when it comes to the threats, the biggest threat that Israel and I think the Western civilization is experiencing at the moment is the Iranian regime that wants to have nuclear weapons. We're speaking about very radical ideology that is very dangerous to our region, and the British government agrees about that, and the American administration and the American president agrees about that. And this is where we need to cooperate in order to fight the Iranian aspirations to reach out for nuclear power. And again, it has nothing to do to whether you support settlements or not, because this is something very crucial to your national security. And as an ambassador, I do that. The third thing, which is probably my favorite, is to communities. One of the things I love to do is to reach out different communities in this country and to speak about the values of Israel as a democratic society that is in the middle of, unfortunately, in a place where there are no democracies. So how we fight for our democracy, how we fight for our values as a country. And again, it has nothing to do to any political affiliation. This is something very big about values of Western countries, like-minded countries. And I enjoy that very much as I enjoy cultural cooperation, academic cooperation, science cooperation. COVID created another pillar to our bilateral relations, which is health cooperation. Israel was leading the world in the vaccination rollout, and Britain was leading Europe in the vaccination rates. And these two countries that were in a very good place of bringing hope to their countries, behind the scenes, I can tell you, it was based on lots of collaboration, science sharing data, many consultants, and even traveling of seniors that came to Israel to experience the fact that we were ahead of everyone in boostering, and we gave everyone a second job. So I would say, thank God, in this job, I can do mainly positive things that build bridges and help people. This is something I really enjoy.
Okay, so you're speaking a lot about collaboration and building bridges.
Diplomacy,
And this is diplomacy, but you also spoke very movingly about your own family dealing with an aerial bombardment of sorts. Yes. So this is a naive question, but you've also said in the past that you did not believe Israelis and Arabs, or Israeli Arabs and Palestinians can live together, which doesn't sound very collaborative. And I'm just wondering whether the policy of the government of building settlements in the occupied territories, surely that inflames passions and makes those aerial bombardments that are so abhorrent to all of us, really, more likely. So wouldn't it be a soft review actually be stabilizing and lead to a more peaceful sort of Israel that you see in the future? Those two things, I mean, perhaps it's naive and you're going to tell me it's naive, but those two views seem to be at odds. You want a safer Israel, but Gaza is right next door. So unless they feel empowered, I suspect those bombs will continue. And the West Bank is also next door. They're really, Israel's next door to some pretty dangerous neighborhoods.
I never believe, actually one thing that it's inaccurate in the way you describe my views. Like in the past, I was usually attacked on the offer to have a one-state solution. Yeah. And I was never into division between Israelis and Arabs. Okay. I think we should live together because the future belongs to coexistence. It's not a new thing.
Maybe you could clarify a little bit. So this is your chance
to clarify. One thing that
is
important. When I run to be a prime minister, I'll come here, I'll tell you my views. But just a joke, but
Yeah.
at the moment I'm representing Israel's elected government.
Yes.
And it's very important for you to understand that as much as you would like and you would love to debate my views, and of course, I would love to express them. At the moment, I'm wearing the diplomat suit, which means I'm representing the Israeli elected government. So what you're going to hear from me is the views of the Israeli government. So you're not going to hear Tzipi Hotovely, you're going to hear Ambassador Hotovely, which speaks on behalf of the Israeli government. So about those questions. Well, first of all, you asked a very, very good question. Israelis and Arabs are in the same territory, very small one, absolutely true. And I think one of the things people miss in the way we live in the Middle East is the fact 20% of Israel's population are Israeli Arabs, being well represented, equal rights, being represented in Israel's government, being represented when it comes to funding. Actually, Israel is doing, they're just like the British government is doing leveling up. So Israel was doing for years leveling up in order to make sure that certain parts of Israeli society won't be left out of Israel's successful economy. And some of them are Jews, like ultra-Orthodox Jews, some of them are Arab communities. Personally, in Israeli parliament, I was the head of Women's Rights Committee. And one of the things I thought was really important is that our women will have equal opportunities to, be part of Israel's success when it comes to promoting women. And I think that this is part of what we do as a country. We have total equality when it comes to 20% minority of Arabs, and we live together peacefully. The problem is, when it comes to Gaza, that you mentioned, Gaza is being controlled by a jihadi motivated terror organization. It's called Hamas. Hamas is recognized by Britain as a terror organization, by the United States, by the European Union. So basically, those are people that their agenda and their ideology says very clearly Israel shouldn't exist. And I think this is the main problem in the Middle East. If you're going to ask me, what's the reason there is no peace between Israelis and Palestinians? The answer is simple. Israel wants to live next to the Arabs. Some radicals among the Arabs, some radicals like Hamas organization, like Iran, don't want Israel to exist. And this is the whole thing in one-liner. And when someone is saying, I don't want you to exist, you don't come and say, so how would you like my funeral to look like? Would you like to have white flowers, red flowers on my grave? This is basically what people that are expecting us to negotiate with terrorists, expecting us to negotiate about the funeral of Israel. We're not interested. The Jewish people lived too many years without a state and unfortunately paid maybe one of the most tragic prices for that when the Holocaust happened, and 6 million Jews were not allowed to be in Israel and didn't have any place to go. So we will never go back to those dark days. And again, this is the problem. They don't want to recognize our right to exist.
So I'm going to throw it up into questions just a moment, but you're looking at some terrific students, and you're also hearing students in the street, literally in the street just outside this building protesting. When you hear, when you see the hostility that's directed toward you, toward your government, do you feel that what is your reaction? Do you feel like this is a giant misunderstanding? If they only understood my views or your government views, they would settle down? Or do you fundamentally disagree? Is it a matter of clarifying the Israeli government's position? How do you react when you encounter the kind of hostility which you have your entire career, and even now that you're, maybe especially now that you're an ambassador?
Well, first of all, one of the things you need to understand, I think, when you look at the broader picture, is majority of the people love Israel, support Israel, and think Israel is an amazing miracle. And when I say that, I don't mean Jews. I mean people in general. When I was a deputy foreign minister for 4 years, so one of the things I did was traveling all around the world. So my perspective is wider than just UK, Israel. So when I was traveling around the world, let's say a country like India, which is a very strong partner of the UK. So you will say a huge country, massive country, they're one of the growing economies in Asia. And they're very much eager to be interactive, engaged with Israel. And when our prime minister walked into the streets of India, you had so many Indians really coming from a very, very heartful place. I visited Israel, India many times as Israelis love India. And you see the love of people have to Israel. They were waving Israeli flags. And I think—
So it's just the students.
No, I think actually I would say people are sitting here. There is a huge difference between criticizing policy and not accepting the idea of having a Jewish state, which I think the majority of the people think that it's very important to have a Jewish state that is called Israel. I would say if you will ask people, should Israel continue to be a democratic country in a few years, people say, of course, because you see how much Israel gets stronger and how much the international connections are getting much more deeper, even with the Arab world. I mean, what I was telling you about the Abraham Accords, my experience, I'm welcomed among my Arab friends, which is even bigger than being welcomed by my British friends. So I would say, first of all, this is a minority. And one thing I can tell you from my former profession, we live in democratic countries. It's okay not to agree on certain policies, as long as you understand that countries are sovereign to make their own decisions. British people make a decision about Brexit. Some people would think that maybe it was a wrong decision, but the British people had to make this decision. The same with Israel, and it comes to its future. Only elected governments in Israel can make the decisions about the future of Israel.
Okay, so let's open this to questions. Thank you very much. Can I just make, I guess, two appeals? One is that you be respectful of our speaker, but also others in the room. And the second, a more mechanical suggestion, but this is just as important, that you be concise. Limit your questions to a minute, and simply for the reason that we'll get more questions in. And you should make your answers.
I would love to hear just what's the field of studies of students who are asking questions, just to
so when you
get a background.
That's good. So when you raise your, when I call on you, or some questions will be online, just identify your field of study. That would be helpful if you wish. So let's start with questions in the room. Sir.
Yeah, so I'm Halamund. I study politics and philosophy.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I'm in my third year. And so basically, I know you want to keep the question short. It's just like a small excerpt I wanted to read from a document. It's not going to be too long. And so basically, the documents here reads, Safsa, which is a former Palestinian village. It's close to Safed. Safsa, 52 men were caught, tied them to one another, dug a pit and shot them. 10 were still twitching. Women came, begged for mercy, found bodies of 6 elderly men. There were 61 bodies, 3 cases of rape, 1 east from Safed, girl of 14, 4 men shot and killed. From one, they cut off his finger with a knife to take the ring. And so this is a document which was let loose by the Israeli Defense Ministry. And it was found in the Yad Yadi archive of Givat Haviva. I don't know if you've heard of them. They are an institute located between Tel Aviv and Haifa. And so basically it describes the Israeli Defense Forces in the operation of Hiram in the year of 1948. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because it appears there is a consensus among Palestine scholars like Tamar Novik, Ben Norris, Ilan Pape, Norman Finkelstein, that there was indeed ethnic cleansing and that the Nakba was a genocidal event. And these documents are being hidden in Israeli archives and are actually disappearing now. And so my question would just be, in light of this historical consensus and the overwhelming primary source evidence, why you made the statement the Nakba is a very popular Arab lie at the Board of Deputies in December 2020. And I'm just wondering, when you say you want to build bridges, isn't that catastrophical? Because you're alienating Palestinians and just telling them actually the genocide that you experienced isn't real. What you're telling us is fake.
It's a very good thing that you're mentioning it, and I was asked about it a few times. So it's a very good opportunity to clarify and put things in context, because I was saying very clear things in a context. The context of the event was the fact that almost 1 million Jews were expelled from Arab countries, experiencing the same as the Arab population experienced. And this thing is something that Israeli history, just like as international history, is erasing from the textbooks. And actually, this is the real problem, because the 1948 war is being documented in every possible way, and everything is accessible. And the most important
So acknowledge the Nakba is real.
no, because
What?
I'm saying again, in order to say something happened, you need to say what you're claiming.
I brought you the primary source evidences. Sorry,
If,
sorry.
if you'll be respectful as much as I was respectful to you. So in order to understand the context, what was happening during those years, you need first of all to see the broader picture of what happened to Jews who were expelled from Arab countries after being suffered and tortured. This is the first thing. And we have plenty of evidence that unfortunately are not part of the discourse. So first of all was
Acknowledge that, yeah.
that was the context of my thing. And the second thing, which is more important, 1948 happened just because of one reason. The Arabs refused to the UN partition plan. What for many years was offered to the Arabs live in Israel was have your own state. This was under the Peel conference. This was under the UN resolution, the very famous UN resolution. And they decided they're not interested that Israel will be a state, and they started a war. This historic truth must be said because it was a war that happened because the Arabs refused to have partition plan. Well, Israel always agreed to have a partition plan throughout all points in history. This is the thing must be into the context of 1948, because what happened in 1948, that while Israel was willing to have an Arab state next to it, the Arabs refused to have Israel next to it.
And that made it okay
And
to
this is the
ethnically
thing,
cleanse
this is the
them.
thing, no historian will say different, because everyone knows why 1948 happened. 1948 happened because the Arabs refused to accept the partition plan. So this is where we begin with. And my answer in Board of Deputies was around expelling this very, very important historic, I would say, catastrophe that happened to the Jews.
But the historical
Arab
scholarship
state.
accepts that, but it
I
also
think I
accepts the
gave you my
Nakba.
answer.
And you
My
say the
answer was
Nakba
the
is wrong.
context. My answer was the context. So you have the context. It
I
was
mean, you
part
realize
of.
this is, you didn't give me an answer. You just said there was Jews being expelled. And that is terrible, of
I
course.
told
But
you
the
that
Nakba
was
is
the context of what
terrible
I
as well.
said.
But I asked you, do you acknowledge the Nakba happened? You said no.
I gave you the answer. What was the context to what I said in Board of
I mean,
Deputies?
do you-
Because this is what you asked.
I mean, this is accurate.
And I gave you another answer, why we look at 1948 war as the result of the refusal, the ongoing refusal of the Arabs to have their own state.
So they brought the
And-
genocide onto themselves.
There was a war.
So you're not
So it was
saying that the context which you feel has not been acknowledged, you're not, just to be clear.
Yes.
Now, that you're not saying that that excuses, assuming these
Not
facts
wrong.
are correct, that puts those, what happened in
What
context, you're
I'm
not saying
saying is
that it was therefore
Israel
justified.
shouldn't,
Just to be,
Israel shouldn't, never in our lifetime, Israel should never say that we should have just said, kill us. This is what you're expecting us to say, because what you're expecting us to say is, okay, fine,
Women
so.
were raped and children were
let
killed.
her.
No, it's very simple. Look, it's a very, very simple answer, and I gave it to you. 1948 war was a war when Israel won after being attacked because the Arabs refused to have their own state or their own whatever sovereignty.
But I mean, why does that justify
Okay, so
genocide?
actually,
That's it.
I suspect similar issues may well emerge, but let some other people.
Appreciate a clear
Let's-
answer.
let's-
She says the
no,
Nakba
we
didn't
have our
happen.
dialogues.
So can I take in the
Wait, do you
back?
realize this is akin to Holocaust denial, what you're doing here? This is completely ridiculous what you're doing.
Everything is clear, and we are not hiding history.
Both events have historical consensus on them, but you cherry pick one of them. Why is
No, I'm
that?
not. I was
You
just
have
trying to look at the
double
broader picture.
What?
Look at the broader picture.
You denied the Nakba. Did the Nakba happen?
So,
Please, don't put words into my mouth.
You said the Nakba did not
No,
happen.
you're putting
If
words
you
into
did,
my
did
mouth.
you acknowledge the Nakba? You said no. You made a very clear statement.
Please, can you introduce yourself and, or?
Sorry, I would like an answer to my question if that is
I
fine with
gave
you.
him an answer. If it's not good enough for you, well, this is my answer.
No, just give me an answer. Why do you have double standards? Why do you acknowledge
Yeah,
one
so,
event?
so you are taking time away from other people, and I suspect that this issue may
Yeah,
well,
I realize that
well be more.
everybody
So
would have time
can-
if she just answered the question. Why does she have
Okay.
double standards?
Sir,
Why is
be
she?
respectful.
I'm very respectful. I'm asking an academic question. Why do you acknowledge?
She's given an
I
answer that
gave
you
you
don't,
my answer.
that
If
you
you don't like my
you don't like
answer,
it, but let other
it's
people
okay.
ask their
No,
questions and get answers that they will like.
Why do you have double standards?
So, sir,
You acknowledge
I
the event of
think-
the
I think
Holocaust was a
there-
big tragedy, but you
there are
deny the
many-
Nakba.
Many people online, and there are many people in this room.
I have an idea. Maybe we'll take a few questions.
We can do that. So,
You're saying the
back to you.
Palestinians will visit your funeral,
Can you-
but
can
you're
you-
putting
sir,
them in a
can you
casket.
please
What are you doing?
let others have a chance.
This is
Yes.
completely ridiculous. I'm not gonna lie.
Hi, I'm a history student here at the LSE, and I was just wondering, do you think anti-Zionism is always inherently anti-Semitic?
Okay, can we take actually, let's actually, we'll take a couple of questions. Let's take one more question in here, and then we'll do, and a third question online, and then we'll gather them together. So you have that one, right?
Yes.
Okay, yes, ma'am. Yes,
Okay, I study international relations, and I just
could you stand up and just make it easier to hear?
I just wanted your opinion on the Lebanese-Israeli conflict because of the increasing presence of Hezbollah in Lebanon at the moment.
And then a question, we're gonna have a question online.
Madam Ambassador, Arab Israelis living in East Jerusalem consistently report discrimination in access to education, water, food, and medical supplies. They can't acquire building contracts, or don't feel the same level of protection afforded to them by the legal system, or by legislature, or by police, as afforded to Jewish citizens. How does the state of Israel ever expect to integrate or garner goodwill amongst a considerable portion of the minority population if they always feel like second-class citizens?
Okay, let's take the
He wanted to ask something, maybe we'll add your question.
We'll add a fourth
Yes,
question?
fourth question, yeah.
Okay, can you introduce yourself?
My name's Sam. I study international relations, and perhaps to lighten the mood just a little, as many of us are aspiring to the field in which you've been rather successful, would you have some advice or maybe wisdom to add as to the diplomatic profession?
Oh, yes, of course, I would love to.
Relatively.
Yeah.
So, the floor is yours. Why don't you?
Okay, so let's start with, but you're gonna need to remind me some of the questions. So you started with anti-Zionism,
Anti-Zionism, and then Lebanon.
anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. Basically, nowadays, if you think about debates about countries, let's say the UK and the US don't like China's policy about many issues, don't like China about human rights. The same about Iran. Everyone knows human rights in Iran doesn't exist. No one is coming on a public debate and saying Iran or China shouldn't exist. I'm being provocative now because think about this incredible, I would say outrageous thing, that the Jewish people are connected to their homeland over 3,000 years. Probably one of the most ancient people being connected to a piece of land. No one in the world has an argument that says Jewish people don't belong to the land of Israel. Everyone knows the historic connection. But even though it's very clear, Israel is the only country that people are challenging whether it should exist or not. This is what makes us wonder whether anti-Zionism is something that is connected to something that is against the only Jewish state in the world. This is why many people make the linkage between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Because you don't wake up in the morning and to say, I don't like the policy of this country, it shouldn't exist. This is something that is totally absurd. And I went to a very radical examples, just like Iran, just to prove that there is no discourse about the right of countries to exist. There is just one country in the world that gets this kind of debate. This is why people make the linkage that is probably based on some common truth that anti-Zionism can be connected to anti-Semitism. The second question was
Lebanon.
Lebanon. Can you be more specific? Because basically, is it about Israel Hezbollah or Israel Lebanon?
And no, I'm more interested in knowing about Israel Lebanon in general, not Hezbollah, because I know that it's like Israel considered it two separate issues in the past. And I just want to know if you see in the near future any peace treaty or anything coming, or if you think that it's a long conflict that's going to take maybe longer to resolve.
Well, Lebanon is a very, very sad story because it was a country that for many years been hijacked by a power that is basically Iranian power. We see Hezbollah as both ideologically and financially based on Iran. And one of the problems that politically, because of the political failed system of Lebanon, that they didn't manage to, unfortunately, again, to have something that will take over the terrorist organizations in the country, it became a base of terror. And this is why we think Iran is so dangerous, because it's not just Iran as a country that declares war on Israel, on the United States, on other Western countries, but it's also the way the Middle East is becoming a big Iranian octopus that is basically destroying countries, just like Lebanon. Lebanon is a failed state because of the Iranian influence inside the country, being used very, I would say, very complicated political circumstances in Lebanon. So basically, the way we see it, we still see it as a front line of Iran, just like Iran was trying to make a military base in Syria. So this is really in our biggest concerns.
We had a question about the treatment.
Oh, the East Jerusalem. There was an assumption in the question that I'm not sure I can accept. Israel, since the 1980s, the Jerusalem bill was passed, and way before that, after the 1967 war, Jerusalem was united under all Israeli governments. All Israeli governments agreed that Eastern Arabs of Jerusalem must be treated equally. And for many years, we've been doing lots of efforts to make sure that the facilities in east side of Jerusalem will be the best, because basically those are places that, as you know, gets lots of tourists. This is where the old city is and many, many ancient historical places. What I think in general, Jerusalem, because one of my friends is the former mayor of Jerusalem, and he invested a lot in the east side of Jerusalem, Nir Barkat. One of the issues with Jerusalem, and again, you need to learn and visit Jerusalem maybe to realize, some Jewish neighborhoods are in very poor conditions, like ultra-Orthodox communities. It has nothing to do to race or to Arabs and Jews. I'm sure many other big cities in the world that have different neighborhoods with different types need to have this kind of efforts to bring all the neighborhoods to the same level. So I would say when it comes to the Israeli leadership, it was very clear that the east side of Jerusalem should be even more precious on the historical level again, in the way infrastructure is made. And actually, I've seen lots of improvements in the last few years, including when it comes to security issues, like cameras all over different areas of east side of Jerusalem, and more facilities and in archaeological sites. So all I can tell you is, even though there is a lot of work to do in general in a big city like Jerusalem, including in many Jewish neighborhoods, I think the direction is very clear. We don't see any difference between Arabs and Jews in Jerusalem.
But doesn't the nation state law implicitly formalize like two different tiers of identity inside the state of Israel?
No.
We had a question about
Diplomacy?
being relatively successful.
Well, thank you. It's a compliment. Look, I don't see myself, again, as someone who comes with many years of experience. I'm still young, but basically, I think politics and diplomacy, they have one thing in common. It's all about people and about connections. And I think COVID was the worst thing that happened both to politics and diplomacy, because you lose the personal contact. I think in order to be a successful diplomat, you need to have many close relationships with as many people, with the most wider spectrum you can reach out in a certain place. First of all, because you need to be out of your bubble, like you need to experience as much as you can. The second thing, I think when it comes to personal relationship, sometimes it's easy to leave like political opinions aside and is to say, let's build something together. So for me, the first meetings I hold here when I came was with the Arab ambassadors. And it was very exciting. It was warm. And when you start something from a personal level and not from, having all the history that you have, it opens your heart. And I think it's really important.
So that seemed to work. Why don't we do that again? A couple of questions in here.
It gives a victim.
Yes, you, sir.
Hi.
Yeah, and we'll do a couple of questions here and then we'll go to
Yes.
I'm
online.
going to take the full 1 minute, if it's okay. Want to sort of say first, I'm sympathetic to the idea of a two-state solution. So please, when I specify your past quotes, I am only doing this in the context of your leadership and the current leadership. So in an inaugural speech to Israeli diplomats in a 2015 Guardian article, you're reported to have said, "This land is ours, all of it is ours, and we have nothing to apologize for it." In this article, you laced your speech with biblical commentaries in which God promised the land of Israel to the Jews. In a 2011 post, in a 2011 article by the Jerusalem Post, in your meeting with Glenn Beck, you say, "This is a religious battle led by Islam. We cannot ignore this basic truth. It's important that we stand behind a historical truth, is that we are here because of the Bible." You also reconcile somehow your views as a religious right-winger and the possibility of coexistence with the Palestinian people. Now, my other issue is that in your leadership in 2020, you served as Deputy Foreign Minister and a Settler Minister for Israel. And since you're saying you want to build bridges with the Palestinian people, during that time, 73 people were displaced, which included this was the largest displacement incident over the 4 years during your leadership, and 41 of them were children. You have also explicitly called for displacement and annexation of Palestinians against the Geneva Convention, Article 49, against legal occupations. Now, let's say that if I was an Israeli under a Muslim state and somebody was annexing me from my home, would I have a right to self-defense and retaliation? Please let me know your thoughts. Thank you.
Okay. Ma'am, on the second tier. Yes, you.
Hi, I'm Angeen. I'm a sociology student, and I just
Sociology.
yeah, and I wanted to ask about, you've talked a lot about sort of the normalization of relations with other states and building peace in the region. How do you reconcile that with a statement you made about the sovereignty of Israel over the land of Judea and Samaria, which would also include parts of Jordan, parts of Syria? Do you not see a sort of tension in between those views?
Okay, and so right directly behind. Yeah, you sir.
Ambassador,
Who are you?
I'm a final year economics and philosophy student. Ambassador, I'm going to ask you a question you probably weren't expecting to answer today, but Israel's COVID policy has become somewhat controversial with the diaspora over the past few months. For the first time in history, Israel seems to have made a distinction between Israeli and a member of the Jewish diaspora. I know many children almost celebrating their bar mitzvahs whose dream it is to be able to celebrate it in Israel, but have not been able to enter Israel in almost 2 years, and it doesn't look likely they will anytime soon, as they're under the age to be vaccinated. As Israelis spent the summer traveling relatively restriction-free, when is Israel going to open its doors to the diaspora fully, many of whom consider Israel their second home, and how does Israel want to repair the relation that this issue has caused?
Let's have a
Yeah, I was sending this question anonymously. The Hamas is labeled as a terrorist organization because of its paramilitary status and because the UK have declared a terrorist organization as well, as you just said previously. By that logic, the IDF has historically been formed from Jewish paramilitary organizations such as Haganah and Ilgun, who were also declared terrorists by the British during the Palestinian Mandate. Why is this double standard applied when Hamas is in question, but not the IDF? And why are IDF actions legitimized while Hamas are labeled terrorists? Thank you.
I had COVID policy, I have Hamas, his question was, I had two ingredients. One was
number
the practical, one was the
past statements.
practical. Basically, the answer, if I take just the
I can
question.
repeat my question.
No, of course, I remember.
Just the question.
I remember your question. I think that basically everyone has access to Israel's Supreme Court. And one of the things people probably miss when they're speaking about, you mentioned the case of you can have someone from his
2020 as a settler minister. Deputy Prime
No.
Minister.
You were giving us very specific example about misplacing, how do you call it?
Displaced?
Displaced.
Displaced.
Did you miss-
Annexation, displacement.
Displacement,
occupation.
okay. One of the things needs to be said. Over 400 Jews were displaced in the order of the Israeli Supreme Court because of illegal building. And one of the things that the Israeli Supreme Court does in different sides is between Jews and Arabs on those issues. So I remember, again, as someone serving Israeli parliament, Jews crying and saying, this is unfair. I paid for this house. And now someone is claiming without even giving proofs that this is his land. And you're keeping me basically out of a house that I got like 2 million shekels, whatever, like I think about 2 million pounds. And with not even having proofs. So what is good about Israel, this is where my first profession comes into an action. I'm a lawyer. Israel has very, very well-respected legal system. Rule of law is really important in Israel. Everyone, Jews and Arabs, can appeal to the Israeli Supreme
Why is it
Court.
breaking the Geneva Convention then?
And wait a second, and I'm respecting each of you with his questions, and they can always appeal to the Israeli Supreme Court. And again, it is important to remember Jews, some of them had to lose their houses because of those issues. And sometimes the thing that I really want to make here as a statement, Israel never makes those decisions, not according to race or religion. It's really
what about the quotes that you mentioned specifically? I just quoted you saying that the problem is Islam, and the reason that you're here is because of the Bible. This is in a Guardian article.
Look, so the fact that historically our first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, on many occasions said the very fundamental right of the Jewish people on his land is the Bible. So this is something many Israeli leaders say. So it's not like I'm unique on this. But I don't think this makes it, like even the Balfour Declaration was based on the historic religious kind of connection. But I think we need to understand what's bothering you. So you're bothered from the idea that part of the problem is—
I'm bothered by your quotes.
No, but part of the problem is that I'm actually saying out loud that part of the problem that radical Islam is on our borders. But unfortunately, when it comes to Hamas or Hezbollah, like she was asking about Lebanon, this is the truth. This is radical Islam being led by jihadi ideology, basically not interested in any kind of compromise. I always ask, it's a very interesting experiment but I had when I was it's a fascinating thing. There was a school of girls in Lebanon, and there was a UN diplomat coming to them and was asking, where are you from? And I said, we're from Tzfat. Tzfat is an Israeli city. And I said, you were second generation born in Lebanon. Why do you think you're from Tzfat? Like, it's very strange. And they told them, because this is where we are from. And they were being raised by a narrative that basically doesn't matter. They don't recognize the idea that Israel exists. So they were speaking about Israel, that no, Israel shouldn't exist. So part of the problem, again, that why do I mention Islam? Not because we're against Islam. We're against radical streams in Islam that deny the right of Israel to exist in the Jewish state. And we need to address this ideology because this is where it's coming from.
Do you think Gaza being an open-air prison has something to do with the fact that they're going to retaliate and use whatever rhetoric they can to tap into the people and use religion as a tool to ensure that there is a resistance force against the Israeli state apparatus, which is much more powerfully funded? I hope you understand the context, ma'am. So why don't you agree with a two-state solution?
Oh, all Israeli governments.
Do you?
No, again, I'm representing a government. It's very convenient to you to attack the politician that I was, but I'm representing Israel's government. Israel's government at the moment is a very diverse government, has diversity of spectrum of opinions from people supporting the two-state solution to people that are not supporting it, just like the prime minister. So I think that what they managed to do, and this is their, at least the official declaration, comes from the foreign minister and from the prime minister, is we want to have better life on the ground because we're after over 30 years of a failed practice of the two-state solution. And this is something everyone should acknowledge. For the last 30 years, all American administrations, all Israeli prime ministers were trying to apply the formula. Every time the formula was on the table, the Palestinians left the table. So all I'm saying, and this is quoting Einstein, here, a very smart guy. If you do a thing again and again, and it doesn't give you the right result, it's probably not the smartest thing to do.
I'm aware of the quote, but there's no mobility in Gaza. You're not allowed to leave Gaza.
I'm just giving you the answer what the Israeli government at the moment wants.
What are the Muslims not allowed to? Well, Palestinians are allowed to use religious texts, but Israelis are. You're saying radical Islam uses religious texts, but you do the same thing. You use the Bible. You use the Bible in saying that we have a right to this land.
To quote the Bible here. Is it not part of freedom of speech?
Well,
No, I agree. There's just a double standard.
yeah, because you say these Muslims use religious texts, they're radicals because of Islam.
No,
Yes.
has nothing to do to using religious texts, has something to do to deny
second
You
my
called
right
yourself
to
a
exist.
religious right-winger publicly. You proclaimed yourself as a religious
I
right-winger.
appreciate the advice. So am I.
Which is about, I believe.
Oh, you want to do
Yeah.
public policy?
Well, that was behind, but
Oh, there was IDF and Hamas?
well, that
Was
is that as
writing-
well. Let maybe
Okay.
COVID, let's do COVID.
COVID, okay. You were asking me probably the hardest question tonight. I'm serious. Because even though it wasn't a policy question, because it was more of health concerns, I was heartbroken from the idea that, as you said, youngsters couldn't come to Israel. And for the first time in our history, unfortunately, we didn't allow tourists to come in, including the Jewish community. So all I can tell you, I'm glad that it's over to a certain extent. At the moment, Israel is launching also kids vaccines. I know in this country it's accessible as well. I'm not giving you my opinion about it because, again, everyone should choose for his own kids. But definitely today, at least, I can stand behind the policy that says, if you're vaccinated, you can come, just like other countries in the world are doing. The United States was not opening its gates to tourists till not long time ago. So it's not like Israel was the only country in the world having this strict policy. Australia had probably the strictest policy when it came to foreigners. It came to really radical circumstances where even its own citizens couldn't just travel back and forth freely if it wasn't for a reason. So all I'm saying is COVID was a very, very challenging time for us. Apparently variants came from different places around the world and we had to create some kind of barrier till the population being vaccinated. Now that Israel was having the boosters to the majority of the people, I'm very glad that we changed the policy and we can open the gates, but it was a very painful policy for me as ambassador to represent, to tell Jews time after time they're not allowed to get into the country from health reasons. Again, it's not like.
So what about little kids who are nowhere near being babies who are nowhere near close to being vaccinated?
I can't hear you.
What about babies who are nowhere?
Oh, babies can come with their parents. It's part of the program that, of course, babies can come.
So, right, fine, you're studying sociology, I missed your name, but
Yeah.
can you just very briefly repeat your question?
Oh, so I was just sort of asking for a clarification regarding some of your views. You've talked about the normalization of relations in the Middle East and beyond. But at the same time, you've made comments about the sovereignty of Israel over the land of Judea and Samaria. And that would encompass parts of Syria and Jordan. So do you not see how that's kind of at odds with building communities and building peace within the region to say something that inflammatory?
Got it.
Is it about Judea and Samaria specifically? But it didn't say anything never about Jordan and Syria. So is it about specifically Judea and Samaria? How do you understand the question?
Well, you made comments about Greater Israel in general as a concept.
No, I was, again, there is a misunderstanding. I was one of the only politicians, again, I'm not here for, just to clarify that. I was one of the only politicians in Israel that supported the one-state solution. One-state solution has nothing to do to Greater Israel. It's just a concept that is different on solving the conflict. It was me as a politician.
Things separately.
No, I was never into dividing, I was always into including, living together,
Including
coexistence.
Israeli Arabs as well. in the
Israeli
West.
Arabs
Yes.
are already
Yes.
part of it. But anyhow, it has nothing to do to the Israeli government at the moment, which is the most important thing. I'm ambassador, I'm representing Israel's government at the moment. Nothing about Greater Israel is being mentioned by me or by the Israeli government.
That's fine.
Yeah, so talking about,
So yes, this question.
as a representation of the government of
Yes.
Israel. So the Israeli settlement program has repeatedly been condemned by the European Union, by the United Nations, as a violation of international law. Even Israel's occupation of the Golan Heights consistently violates principles of international law.
So is it about the?
So no,
Is it about IDF or is it about?
Yeah, the question is the two words, but sorry. The settlement program is consistently condemned as a violation of international law. You yourself described earlier how Israel is a rule of law country. Why does Israel not seem to respect international laws and norms in the same way as other countries expect it to?
We truly believe that because, again, all Israeli governments and Israeli Supreme Court, we need to understand what is international law when it comes to Judea and Samaria. In order to say you're occupier, you need to take a lens from a different country that has sovereignty according to international law. Follow this because it's really important. The country that was taking over Judea and Samaria before the 6 Days War was Jordan. Jordan was not a legitimate power according to international law in holding the piece of land that is called Judea and Samaria. It was occupier. This according to international law. So when Israel was taking over Judea and Samaria in a defense war, the sovereign was not Jordan. And the sovereign was definitely not the Palestinians because.
What was the sovereign?
What?
Your point is there was no sovereign.
Exactly. So because there was no legitimate sovereign, like there was occupiers, which was the Jordanians. So all I'm saying is there was at least mispresentation of the reality on the ground in terms of international law, who has the sovereignty on Judea and Samaria. And we claim, because the sovereignty of Jordan is illegitimate according to international law, no one defers that, Israel has the right to, the Jews will live in places where they used to live for many years. So we definitely have a connection to Judea and Samaria. No one, again, can say different. But I want to say something bigger because, again, I can give you all the arguments about international law. You can be happy, or you can, say some scholars say different. But eventually, the big question is this the obstacle to peace? Because what happened in history, when settlements were in some kind of negotiation or anything, Israel was willing to let go. Israel was willing to let go on the Camp David Accords. Israel was willing to let go in 2005 on the disengagement program of Arik Sharon. So one of the things it's important for me to deliver as someone that understands your point of view. You want peace. You really, your question is not whether this place or another. You really want peace, and you're looking for who is the one to be blamed. And it's so convenient to say some houses and kindergartens are the obstacle. But the truth is, the PLO, the resistance to the state of Israel. Okay, let's quiz you. When was the PLO established? What year?
1964.
Very nice. When was the 6 Days War? When the settlement project started? 1967. So it has nothing to do with settlements. This is the biggest argument. It has nothing to do with settlements. When settlements were moved in 2005, it's not like it made it better, but actually it made it worse because Hamas took over. So it's one thing to claim international law, and again, I can give you all the answers as a legal issue, but it's also important to understand this is not the barrier. This is not the obstacle. It has never been. And in my opinion, if you say to certain Jews, you're not allowed to live in a certain place, think about London. Can you imagine communities that cannot live in London in certain areas? I think it would have sounded really bad. So same about Israel. Jews can live everywhere, just like we believe Arabs can live everywhere.
Palestinian Arabs cannot settle everywhere, though.
There are Arabs in Haifa, in Nazareth, everywhere.
Palestinians. If you are Palestinian in the West
They
Bank,
see
you
themselves
cannot
as
just move to
Palestinians.
Israel.
Yes.
There are
There was
Palestinian.
a question about the idea of Hamas that I think you forgot in the last quota.
The
Yes.
previous, so can you repeat the
Yeah.
question?
Yeah, I have it with me. I'll just repeat it. A second.
Yes, I'm enjoying myself very
Yeah.
much. It's very respectful.
So the question was, the Hamas is labeled as a terrorist organization because of
Sorry.
the Hamas is labeled as a terrorist organization because of its paramilitary status and because the UK has also declared a terrorist organization. By that logic, the IDF, which has historically been formed from Jewish paramilitary organizations such as Haganah and Irgun, who were also declared terrorists by the British during the Palestinian Mandate. Why is this double standard applied when Hamas is in question, but not the IDF? And why are IDF's actions legitimized while Hamas are labeled terrorists?
Oh, very simple. Actually, this is a simple question. Basically, all armies in the world, British Army, American Army, they all, unfortunately, when they fight for good reasons, they have casual damage, right? Collateral damage.
Friendly fire.
Unfortunately, again, they don't aim to harm civilians. They never want to harm civilians. But unfortunately, especially when you're fighting terror organizations that being based among civilians, you end up, unfortunately, again, and we always feel it's a big tragedy to lose human life. This is part of all military armies in the world. The difference, the basic difference between terror organization and an army, a legitimate army, is whether are you targeting civilians or not. It's as simple as that. IDF never targets civilians, period. IDF will target civilian places where rockets being launched from, because according to international law, you're allowed to target places that are the infrastructure of a terror organization. But IDF never, and I can stand behind this, IDF never targets civilians. Terror organizations are targeting civilians. When Hamas was firing rockets on kindergartens in Sderot and in Ashkelon, it wanted to kill children. Israel never wants to kill any innocent
Does
person.
it always alert when it fires on a house or a complex that may have children
Yes,
or
we
innocents? And how is that done?
We do it in many ways. One of the things we do is our airplanes are sending like a brochures to say this place is going to be under attack. We sometimes call people, but basically every time that IDF is attacking, we always make sure that the people will be informed that they need to clear up.
So let's take another round. So you, sir, why don't you start us off?
Okay,
And
sure.
introduce yourself.
Hi.
And please, this might well be the last round. So try to be, the shorter the questions, the more we can get in. So really be concise.
Hi, my name is Shaurya. I am a PPE student, so philosophy, politics, economics.
Politics, philosophy, and economics.
Oh yeah, we have it in Israel as well, probably inspired by you.
Philosophy, okay.
Yeah,
I'm from the United Arab Emirates, so I'm living from the Middle East, even though I'm an Indian citizen. So my question is about specifically your current government, as well as your current tenure as Deputy Foreign Minister. So it's not related to the Israel-Palestine issue. I think other people have much more info than me about it. So in 2015, under your tenure as Deputy Foreign Minister.
Can you be just more slowly?
Sorry. In 2015, when you were Deputy Foreign Minister,
Yes.
Prime Minister Netanyahu decided to make a very controversial foreign policy decision where he addressed a joint session of Congress in the invitation of Representative John Boehner from the Republican Party without informing President Obama or the Democratic Party, which caused huge issues. This was specifically to reduce the chances of the JCPOA, which is a nuclear deal with Iran, from manifesting. So I just have like two parts to it. My first question is, why exactly do you think it is helpful to reduce the possibility of reducing tensions with Iran in the Middle East? Isn't it more likely that when we have reduced relationships with Iran, it increases the threat for people living in countries like mine in the United Arab Emirates, or even yours, as Iran gets more desperate and is more likely to use military tactics to gain more leverage? But the second part of this is, why exactly is Israel going to benefit from politicizing its own support in the United States by cooperating with the Republicans behind the Democrats' back? There is bipartisan support in the US, but at the point where you cut one party out of negotiations and work with the other, Israel itself suffers because it politicizes their support for it. So on those two questions, could you talk about what the current government plans to do?
Yeah, it's a very long question, so.
Sorry.
It's an excellent question.
You remember, you want to hit it,
You want to take a few more? I'm writing down, so.
Okay, good. Why don't you write
The
it?
paper's gonna remember.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so my name is Stefan. I'm also a PPE student.
What's your name?
Stefan.
Stefan.
So my question is related to more or less to terminology and to
Can you speak up?
my question is more.
Okay. Oh, yeah, good.
Okay, so my question refers to the organization Lahava, called, according to many human rights observers, Lahava is a non-state actor, but it is a racist supremacist group which opposes, actually fights minorities present in Israel. They have committed arson, vandalism, and called the stopping of the Jewish blood from becoming impure. In 2011, they were given a platform within the Knesset and with the slogan that it is important to prevent the assimilation of the Holy Land right now. Do you think that there is a double standard when Israel or another country lashes out against Hamas, a non-state organization which is extremist, and while in other countries some right-wing extremist organizations are given a platform to speak within the National Assembly?
Thank you. Okay.
I wish I could listen to everyone.
I just want to,
Brilliant
one more.
questions.
So, ma'am, in the back.
Tell me if they're gonna ask really quickly, then we will do more.
Yeah. So you, ma'am, yeah. Maybe you could stand up
I'm a senior politics and economics student, and I'm gonna ask, in the essay you showed an empty book, you said that this book is the history of Palestinians, implying that they have no history. To quote you exactly, you said, "This book is empty. Do you know why it is empty? Because they have no kings, they have no heritage sites." You directed these comments towards the Arab MKs. How do you reconcile this with what you said earlier, that you want to build bridges with the Arab population? Even today, you use the word Palestinian, and my very simple question to you is, who is a Palestinian to you?
We really need to. This is good.
Yes,
Can
excellent,
we,
yes.
can we violate all rules and norms? Let's take one from online, because I suspect there are
Sure.
quite a few people. And then that will be the last question, I'm afraid.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so I think this is sort of collating a lot of these sort of statements that we seem to be receiving online. You consistently sort of describe the Israel-Palestinian conflict, but this is somewhat extremely asymmetric warfare, where Palestinians seem to be facing egregiously much more deaths, a lot more children are dying comparative to the number of Israelis dying. If you are the people who have much more power, much more control, why are you not being much more considerate in your ability to negotiate or willing to make more concessions, given the fact that you're killing thousands of them, but relatively few Israelis?
It's an excellent question, I'll say. Everything is excellent. Would you like me to go from the back to the, like,
however you wish.
Is that okay? I want to do the back. I really like your question, but it's, we'll do it this way. Okay, we'll finish with Iran. Such a cheerful note. Okay, good. So, casualties. Casualties is a very big question. I've been asked here many times. So the unfortunate circumstances on the ground that create casualties is the fact the terror organization called Hamas is using the children and women and innocent people, and it creates all its bases and the infrastructure of the organization in the middle of civilians. So basically, they're doing it because they don't care about the children. They're using them as human shields, as we always say, and it's true, unfortunately. And this is part of, I call it the asymmetric moral war. When democratic country is fighting for its values, for the freedom of our people, for the fact that my children won't be under a rocket attack. I'm using, first of all, I'm using Iron Dome in order to protect my civilians, and they're not doing anything like that. They're not encouraging their population to leave the places, even though IDF is warning them. So I would say, and again, unfortunately, I'm not happy that it's happening. Actually, I'm very sad. Every casualty is something that I wish we could prevent.
I'm sorry, this is a lie. There's a BBC report saying that there's an IDF member who specifically killed a 12-year-old Palestinian boy in the occupied West Bank, and this is actually reported the investigation that there were 3 Israeli soldiers rounding up on this boy. This is a lie. I'm sorry. There's multiple reports like this.
I'm saying again, every soldier that is abusing force is being under a trial. This is the difference.
Happens consistently.
This is the difference. Our legal system is very clear about what you're allowed to do and not allowed to do with using force. And you know, here,
impunity.
Here in this country, you can find policemen sometimes that can use force. He will be under trial, just like any other soldier in American Army or British Army. But this is the difference between terror organization and legitimate democratic country that is trying to fight in order to protect its people. So the answer.
Countries don't do genocidal events, but yeah.
This is the answer about casualties. There was the question about a speech I gave in Parliament, I think, about kings. So I just want to give again context. It was in Israeli Parliament. I was quoting Nathan Alterman, one of our greatest poets, in a very, very famous song he gave called Kingdom. So first of all, it's very important, again, when you hear a speech of a parliamentarian, it's important to understand what he's saying. So I was quoting Nathan Alterman, very, very famous Israeli, very respectful Israeli poet, that has a very famous song called Kingdom. And it was about how many sites in Israel were named in Arab names, even though historically there were Jews. So I was quoting this song. It's a poet, it's a very famous poet. And I think part of it was, again, to say that there is a denial of Jewish history in our homeland. And I think one of the most, I would say, shameful moments in the leadership of the Palestinians was when Bill Clinton was asking Yasser Arafat, was their temple on Temple Mount, which is sometimes something they can ask a child, right? Temple Mount, makes sense. It was a temple on Temple Mount. And the answer of Yasser Arafat was definitely not. And it was historical denial of something that everyone knows that was there. And I was going against historical denial of the connection of the Jewish people to their homeland. This is the context, and it's very important to remember that. I think the Palestinians are my neighbors, and I would love to have peace with them, just like I had with other neighbors in our region, like the Egyptians and the Jordanians and the Gulf countries. And I think that it's really a matter of the right leadership to choose to live peacefully with us, because everyone gains from peace, no one gains from wars. Yes. Which was your question about Iran?
Politicizing Israel in America.
Oh, politicizing. Okay, so the truth is, Lehava, I don't know, I don't know what's the connection between Lehava and Hamas. Lehava doesn't call to kill people. Like it's a very radical organization.
Its members commit
Well,
arson.
it's equal. Let's say it does not.
Look, it's an organization.
It's the radical form of expression within the country.
One of the things,
much like as Hezbollah or Hamas are within the Arabic.
so when we're saying a certain organization is a terror organization, it's usually defined by a country. The word radical and terror, it's not always the same. You can be very radical and still in the legitimate spectrum of a country, but you're not a terror organization. So Israeli parliament allows every organization, whether radical or not, to give it's freedom of speech moment in parliament, just like I believe it's democratic parliament.
Vandalism and attacking people.
Wait a second, but this is part of freedom of speech. This is value in democratic societies. We appreciate freedom of speech, even with ideas we don't agree with, as long as it's not something that's going to put in danger someone. This is the balance we do between freedom of speech and security and defense of people. So all I'm saying is, I don't need to agree with certain organizations, but I'm happy that my parliament has freedom of speech. It has nothing to do with terrorism. Terrorism is a very identified thing. Again, it's globally identified. It's not a matter of territory. Everyone agrees that Hamas is a terror organization, and we shouldn't give any discounts to organization that wants to kill my children and wants to kill all the children that are in Israel. So this is the thing, we cannot make the comparison. Iran.
Yeah,
So your question had two parts. One was very political, whether Netanyahu did a good thing or a bad thing. So in Israel, we had a very, very big debate around what he did. Yes, some people said, first of all, of course, every Israeli leader can go speak in American Congress. This is not something that is illegitimate. The only thing was the question whether it was a good thing or a bad thing when you have democratic administration, etc., just like you presented it. And many people in Israel thought when it comes to strategic issues, it's more important to make a statement, more important to prevent something that in the views of Israel was a disaster, like the JCPOA. And so this is the answer to the political question, right? The political question. So I would say some people felt like you. In Israel, it was a debate. Some people thought it wasn't a good idea. Some people thought it was a good idea. But the people said it was a good idea is that it's not like you're going every day to the American Congress doing something against the American president.
Will your government be focusing on bipartisan support in America, or will they be negotiating more with one party than the other?
So it's very simple. We always do bipartisan work, but historically, let's give the Begin example. Our Prime Minister Menachem Begin made a decision, a very critical, very historic decision to attack a nuclear site in Iraq. And he did that without informing the Americans, which were our allies. Reagan was really upset. There were sanctions around this decision. And then Menachem Begin made a very famous statement. And he said, when I need to choose between the security of my people and the friendship with an ally, I will always choose the security of my people. So this is Menachem Begin a long time ago. And it was a doctrine that many Israeli leaders are saying, I'm going to use this idea of doing something against my friend's opinion when it's something very critical and crucial about my future. Going back to your first question, which I think is even more important about how we see Iran. So it's very clear and everyone agrees that Iran is not into playing a fair game with the international community. Iran has a goal, and at the moment, the person who sits on the leadership chair in Tehran is a mass murderer called Raisi, His like name was the butcher from Tehran. Those are people that don't respect their own people. Basically, they don't keep the human rights of their own people. This is a very radical regime that wants to reach nuclear weapons, and it's doing all the practical things in order to get it. All the international organizations at the moment, like the IAEA.
Excuse me, sorry, Madam Ambassador.
No, I want to give the answer. So the answer.
Equity thing,
she's
please
like-
refrain from mentioning or like you're using religious kind of description in terms of connecting with the other ideologies. Thank you.
Can you just say that?
Refrain from using religious, I guess, anecdotes and whatnot when describing certain things.
She's saying stop being Islamophobic, basically.
Using some religious.
If for all, any religion also.
Okay, that being said, I think it is important that like.
You get the answer to your question.
Okay, thank you so much. Sunny, I do think it's important for us to refrain from using particular forms of religious expression, that dialogue. That being said, we've unfortunately run 15 minutes over time. The ambassador is unfortunately on a very tight schedule. So that being said, I would just like to, on behalf of the LSESU Debate Society, extend our thanks